Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this video, we are going to be plumbing the Del Sol. So, went ahead and got all of the fittings necessary for this. You can see two of the number 16s here. There is a number 16 down low, and there is a number 16 that will go in here. Yeah, you can see the thermostat there onto the thermostat housing, which that is what this fitting is for here, or the weld bung rather. So I would like to thank, before we get started on this, my good friend Johan at LZMFG, as well as Duarte at Drift HQ for getting me a few of these hose ends that were out of stock at the normal warehouse that I use. And they came in clutch and were able to get these to me. So I greatly appreciate that. Thank you guys very much. And with that being said, now we can begin on the first portion of this plumbing, or these plumbing escapades, which will be restoring this water, or this thermostat housing. As you can see, it has seen better days. Lots of corrosion there, lots of corrosion on the outside here. It is not pretty, but I think we should be able to restore this thing, or at least I'm going to give that an attempt before I source a new one, as unlike the upper water neck that we built the fill pot onto, this thing has this spherical dimension here that is necessary for the proper function of the thermostat. So I can't just easily make a flange and put something together for that. It needs to be an OE part, or I guess something, if Speed Factory sells an aftermarket one, could always go that route, but we'll try this first. So what I need to do to begin is to get this paint off and to see how bad this corrosion, how bad this aluminum actually is. And it doesn't look very promising right now, but we don't know until we do know. So let me go ahead and get geared up with some PPE, and we can start taking the paint off and see exactly how bad this thing is. Alright, we were able to take this thermostat housing and get it in good enough condition that I was able to weld this weld bung onto it. Not the prettiest weld, but these, or at least in my experience, these Honda thermostat housings use notoriously bad aluminum in their construction, but was able to make the bung and the thermostat housing all one piece. So I'm going to now take this coolant sensor, and the O-ring has seen much better days that is on this thing. And if I can get the O-ring off, then I'm going to replace it, so that way it will not leak from that area. There we go. Yeah, that O-ring is absolutely smashed flat. So I have this O-ring assortment that go in here and find one that corresponds to the size. Maybe this one. Yeah, good first guess. So get ourselves a new O-ring, and I can thread this guy back into here, and we'll be good to go. So I'll do that, then meet you guys over at the car to reinstall this, and then we can finally start making our AN lines. We are now ready to begin assembling the Del Sols. Well, we'll start with the radiator lines. So what I have on the bench here, we have aluminum soft jaws so we don't end up marring our hose end. I have a 1.5 inch wrench, which I will go over why I have and use this in a little bit. We have vibrant hose cutting shears. We have some brake caliper grease, which this doesn't necessarily matter which grease you use, just as long as you are lubricating the threads somehow. Then we have 5 feet of number 16 hose. So as I am building lines, the way that I like to do this, and bear in mind, I'm sure there are a multitude of other options and a multitude of other ways to do this. This is just how I prefer to. I will put one hose end on the line. I will put it in its position, run the line where it needs to go. So we have our hose end that will go on our thermostat housing here. I'll put that hose end on. Then we can string the line down to where it will go, which in this case, we are going from thermostat housing to bottom of radiator. And once we have that hose end on, it makes it very easy to determine the length that the hose needs to be cut to and to cut it to the appropriate length, to the correct length, so you don't end up too short or too long. So we'll go over this and I'll show you guys a few other tips and tricks that I use, especially for these large diameter hose ends. But let's go ahead and get to it. So let's go ahead and we'll get set up to put this first hose end onto the hose. So take my vice blocks, or my soft jaws rather, and I will simply put them into the vise, like so. And we can then take the collar or the nut portion of the hose end off of the actual fitting portion, or the degreed portion of it. So the first tip that I will show you guys is with these large diameter hose ends, you don't want to put them too far into this collar, because if you do that, it makes them nearly impossible to install properly. So let me go ahead, I'll get this guy on here, and then I can show you exactly what I'm talking about. On these collars or nuts or whatever you want to call them, you can see right there, there are a series of ribs on the inside. So with these large diameter hoses, I will put the hose up to the last rib there. So it might be difficult to see, but where my finger is, right, maybe somewhere in there. I'll show you on the hose itself and this collar on it. So you can see that I leave a bit of a gap past the threads, and that gap does not affect the sealing of our hose end at all. And it makes it so you can actually thread the hose end down the whole way and have it look like you actually put forth a little bit of effort, as opposed to just jamming the hose the whole way in there and not being able to cinch it down the whole way. As these fittings are so large and there's so much going on inside of this collar that there isn't enough space if you run the hose the entire way up to the hose end to tighten it down the whole way and to have it look proper. So beyond that, why we have the 1.5 inch wrench out here, if I flip this around, you can see that 1.5 inch is the corresponding size to the portion that we are actually threading into our collar here. So in this case, and this is not the case for all sizes of AN fittings, the number 16 AN wrench does fit appropriately onto the fitting here. So this would work to use the number 16 wrench, but this steel wrench gives us better leverage to tighten this down. And with different sizes of AN lines, the corresponding AN wrench typically does not fit the nut that we are actually tightening down, or the fastener head, I guess you could call it for lack of a better description, on the hose end. So you will get to the point when it's either usually way too loose and you'll end up rounding the hose end off, marring the finish on it, having it not look as good as it could because you weren't using the correct tool for it. So I like to use these big wrenches. I was able to source them, I believe, from my local Tractor Supply Co. and a tractor shop or heavy machinery shop ends up being a good place to get these large wrenches, as obviously they are working with large fasteners. So with all that said, let's go ahead, put this into the soft jaws right here. Then we can grease the hose end and start threading it into the collar and making this connection solid. So what we next want to do in preparation to install the actual hose end into the collar is to liberally apply grease. And this will help save our threads and make this installation process go a little bit easier. So you can grease all around the threads. I like to grease the actual nipple portion of it as well. However, I attempt or try my hardest not to get grease actually into the inside of the hose end itself, as grease in the cooling system, don't really need grease in there, so it's best not to put it in there. So from here, we take our greased up fitting and we get it seated into the hose, push in, and we get our threads started, or attempt to. Once we feel the initial bite, we can switch over to using the wrench and start working our way down. Now, as I'm doing this, I try to be very careful not to drag the wrench across the fitting, as even though these are anodized, the anodizing can still be fairly delicate, and I am not a big fan of having messed up fittings on cars. I think it looks a little bit tacky and looks like you didn't really put forth a whole lot of effort when you were assembling them. So a little bit of marring can be unavoidable, but a whole lot of it where it looks like you clamped down with a pipe wrench or something along those lines is just unacceptable in my book. So we are getting close to where we need to be with this. Just a little bit more tightening, and we'll show you the final step that I employ when I am putting these connections together. That is pretty close. I'm going to call that good. So the final step that I like to take is to match up flat to flat. And it makes it look, again, like you actually put forth a little bit of effort as you are doing this. And we will now pull this, set you guys back down, but we'll pull this connection out of the soft jaws. Give her a little tug test, as you obviously shouldn't be able to pull the hose out of the hose end. In this case, it passes. This connection is done, and we can move on to the next one. So let's go over to the car, and we can figure out where this hose needs to be cut to match up appropriately to the lower fitting on the radiator. Now I'll go ahead and wipe the little bit of excess grease that pushed out as these two portions of this connection were squished together. Once we have that done, we can put this onto the car. So hopefully you guys can see a bit. I know that probably not the best angles in the world, but there is quite a bit going on in this engine bay at this point, so you'll just have to bear with me. So we'll go ahead and fish this hose through the engine bay to its home, and I will hand thread this hose end onto the thermostat housing, which if you ever worked with AN fittings before, typically there's like one specific way that you can get the hose end to start on the male side of the fitting. In this case, it is fighting me a bit, so here we go. All right, got some threads now, and I'm just going to hand thread this on here. There's no reason to tighten it down the whole way right now, as it will be coming back off in a moment. So that's a pretty good track for our line there. And actually, I wonder if I can put this through this gap here. Yes. Just to get me a little bit better angle on this fitting here so I can cut the line to the appropriate size. So, all right, we are good to go there. Now, move underneath the car and I'll show you guys how to mark out and how to cut the line. All right, so we're obviously underneath of the car, and we have the line ran down to just about where the hose end is on the lower portion of the radiator. So I like to use a metallic permanent marker, in this case a Milwaukee, and we will come in and mark the hose, allowing for enough wiggle room for engine flex and engine movement and everything else, and still accounting for where that rib is on the inside of the collar. So this is kind of a little bit of a guessing game, but I think it will be somewhere right about there. So now, always be sure to cap your marker. We go back up top, pull the hose back off, make our cut using our hose shears, which, as you will see in a moment, are an indispensable part of doing these jobs. And we can assemble this line, and this one will be done. We can move on to the upper, and then we'll have the cooling system completed. All right, back over at the bench, we have our mark right here, and we also have our hose cutting shears. So the old school way of making these lines, or the way that I was initially taught, was using an angle grinder or some sort of abrasive cutting tool to cut the line. Does it cut the line? Yes. Is it the appropriate way to do it, or the proper way? Absolutely not. And the reason for that is the debris. So as you are running the abrasive through the line, you are kicking up all kinds of sediment off of the line, rubber debris, metal debris, etc., into the inside of the hose. Now, you could make the argument that if you clean the hose out, you'll be good to go to use that line. And you're probably right, but it's messy. You end up fraying the line as you do that, unless you put a bunch of tape over the outside of it, which it's then a guessing game as to where you are actually making your cut. Whereas these do not cause any of those issues. So they are very simple. All you do, you loop them around where you want to make your cut, which will be right about here, and literally just squeeze, get some leverage, and we made our cut. You can see no fraying, no anything weird going on, just a nice clean cut, no cleanup required, and we are ready to put the next hose end onto the hose. So I'll go grab that off of the car. We can get going on that, and this lower line will be completed within a matter of minutes. We have our second hose end connection completed. So again, pop it out, do the old tug test, and also look to make sure that the hose is going straight into the collar. If it's kicked one way or another, what that likely means is that as the nipple was entering the hose, it likely pushed it out of where it was seated in the collar, and that is not going to be a good seal. As the way these obviously work, the nipple goes into the hose, the collar on the outside threads up, the nipple's tapered, it pinches the hose between the collar and the hose end fitting itself. That is how you create your seal, and that is how these hoses function. So we have this hose all together at this point, we can go over, throw it on the car, and move on to the upper hose. After a little bit of elbow grease, we have completed coolant lines for the Del Sol. So these came out really, really nice. You have a 45 and a 60 and a 45 and a 30. So I changed up the order of the hose ends a little bit from how I initially intended on building them, but once I got the fittings in, threaded them onto their respective male sides, they kind of made the decision for me as to where they were going to end up at. So really happy with how all this came out. And I know I may seem a little bit crazy with the way that I do these lines, or a little bit particular rather, but when I was building the AN lines for the silver car for the Radiator the last time, as you guys may know, in a 2JZ, obviously the engine sits in line with the center line of the car, and you have one radiator hose that snakes around right in the front of the engine, dead nuts in the front of the engine bay. So I had number 20 lines on that, and I made all the mistakes that I could to destroy hose ends as I was trying to put those lines together. I was trying to be extraordinarily meticulous as I was assembling the engine bay, and those stuck out like a sore thumb. So what I ended up doing was junking probably 3 to 5 hose ends just by marring them and figuring out the process that I just showed you guys. So you can take the knowledge that I have, that I've shown how to make these larger lines here, and use them on your own projects to not mar your fittings, to make your bay look that much nicer. And it is truly those little details that will set your car and your build apart from everybody else's. So now that we have these coolant lines done, that leaves just the catch can lines outstanding, which I'm still waiting on 2 fittings for those, or 2 hose ends rather. Have all the line, have everything else, and those hose ends will arrive tomorrow. So tomorrow we can come back, we can hit this thing again and get the last 2 lines built, which the number 10 lines are a little bit easier to put together than these big boy number 16 lines are. And at that point, all the plumbing is done, and this thing is more or less complete, aside from maybe a couple little ancillary bits when I do the final once over and make sure that I didn't miss anything. So I will see you guys tomorrow when we will continue with this, get the rest of the plumbing wrapped up, and then we can see it in all of its glory. We are back to work more on the plumbing for the Del Sol project. So, first part of the video, we went ahead and made the radiator lines for it, and now we can move on to the catch can lines. So, let me put the hood up on it and we can see what we are dealing with. Now, we have our 2 fittings on the valve cover, and we have our 2 fittings on the catch can there. And we need to make lines that go from valve cover to catch can to vent off any excess blow-by that the engine produces in its normal operation. So we have, and again, huge thank you to the Drift HQ and LZ MFG guys. They came in clutch with getting me the few fittings rather, that were outstanding from my normal supplier, and those guys really saved the day. Can't thank them enough for it. So Johan, Duarte, Adam, everybody at LZMFG and Drift HQ, thank you guys very much. You guys are lifesavers. So we have our 2 number 10 90s. Oh, Nice, they sent a little swag pack as well. Pretty sweet. And we also have our 245s. And we have a couple sections of hose. Now they didn't have a hose in between these sizes, so I needed to get a little bit more than 5 feet, but not quite 10. So a 5 foot to 2 foot roll, simple math tells me that's 7 feet, and that should be more than enough to build these two lines. So let me go ahead and pop these hose ends out of their bags. I can put them in their respective homes in the engine bay, and we can start stringing the lines and see exactly where these hoses are going to, or exactly the forms and the shapes they are going to take. Now we have the plumbing completed for the Del Sol project. So our catch can lines came out very nicely. Plenty of clearance to the intercooler tube, plenty of clearance to the throttle cam, plenty of clearance to everything around the engine bay. And I also went ahead and made little zip tie line spacers, which the easy way to do this is you loop the zip tie around 2 lines, and then you loop a zip tie around the center of the zip tie that you looped around the 2 lines, tighten the center one down, and you have a nice handy line spacer that doesn't cost you anything as opposed to paying for billet ones or something along those lines. So if you like the look of the billet ones, by all means go with them, but this is the cheap, easy, and effective solution, and if they get damaged at all, you're just a couple of zip ties out as opposed to having to buy more billet ones, spend more money, so on and so forth. So I am going to go ahead and go underneath of the car, and I started making this little bracket right here, which that will be an auxiliary exhaust mount that will bolt onto the back of the block. I will have one of these hanger rods off of it, and I will put one hanger rod on the exhaust just to give it a little bit more support in the area of that flex bellow underneath of the Del Sol. So once I have that done, we can take the Del Sol off of the race ramps, off of the jack stands, put it down onto the ground, and see how everything looks at ride height. So I'll go ahead and get this knocked out, and we can do that here in a little bit. I went ahead and put the auxiliary hanger on the Del Sol's exhaust. So let's see if we can see it from here. And yeah, you kind of can there. Maybe a foot or so past the flex bellows. And I built that little bracket that I showed you guys earlier, at least the beginnings of it, and bet a couple of hanger rods up. And now it is solid, and I feel a little bit better about that flex bellows being in there. So now everything under the car is done, and it can come off of the stands that it's on, being the race ramps and the jack stands, put it down on the ground, and we can see how it looks in all of its glory at ride height. So I'll throw you guys on the tripod and do a little time lapse of that, and then we can take a look at this thing in all of its finished glory. After going for a little bit of a sliding ride, pulling that thing down off the race ramps, not sure if you guys could see that in the video or not, but the brakes in the rear of the car ended up going for a little bit of a slide. Thankfully, not on my knees or anything. sliding my boots along the ground, but all went well. We were down on the ground, and it's always funny when you bring a car, especially a lower little compact car like this, off of a lift or off of jack stands or something along those lines. You finally remember just how low they are. I mean, this thing, I could, in my 6'2" frame, could bend over comfortably and work on it, and now it is maybe up to about my knee at the front of the hood there. So just a little funny bit that I always laugh at every time that I pull one of these cars or anything I'm working on and put it back on the ground. So without further ado, we'll do the final reveal, which you guys have obviously already seen, but hood pops and there we go. Full turbo system. Have obviously manifold, downpipe, titanium intercooler tubes, all of the associated cooling lines, the catch can lines, the catch can itself, the mid pipe, which we can't see right now as the car is on the ground. And that should be about it for this project. I don't recall having to do anything else on it. I could be wrong. I have to look through the invoice, look through the paperwork, but the only thing that I'm not super stoked on, and we may end up addressing this and be able to solve it with a simple fix, is the muffler sits awfully tight on that bumper skin. So when the car was up in the air and the suspension at full droop, the rear section of the exhaust was actually sitting on the sway bar and or the control arm. I guess it would be the sway bar. But down at ride height here, we have clearance there, and I might be able to get away with just a couple of extended exhaust hangers to drop that muffler section down just a little bit that it needs to clear the bumper in a little bit more desirable manner. But that is a very simple fix, and we have the whole turbo system built for this car, and I'm very, very happy with how it came out. So no bumper on obviously, but there we see the big old KLM cooling module. And one part I did forget to reiterate is this car has air conditioning, and that was the impetus for building things in the manner that we did, as once you get one of these cooling modules and you have the thickness of intercooler, radiator, and in this case the AC condenser right there, it really throws a wrench in your plans as far as locating the turbo in a fairly traditional spot. So we had to do some creative, we had to take artistic liberty, I guess, with building this whole system, and I couldn't be happier with how it has how it's came out. So now that this project is essentially a wrap, I will show you guys one other thing that I've been working on. And you may have seen this if you follow any of my social media pages, or if you keep up to date with the BPA website. But going back to Yamaha stuff, I know I haven't mentioned this thing for a while. I apologize for that. We'll get back to it pretty shortly, but we now have the production BP Autosports exhaust manifold for the YXZ 1000R. I'm sure it's a little bit dark right now. Obviously the bay door is shut, but there you can get a pretty good idea of the form of these things. And I pulled the manifold that I had built for it initially off the prototype more or less and put this production piece on so I could start developing a hot parts kit for these. So my plan is to offer a hot parts kit consisting of a turbo, a manifold, wastegate, and an exhaust. So the manifold will be offered in 304 stainless or 321 stainless like all of my other ones. The exhaust components will be offered, I'm planning to at least, I haven't done all of the foundational work for it just yet, but the plan is to offer the exhaust components in 304 stainless or CP1 Ticon titanium. So that will give you the option to, or like all of my other products, I like to provide my customers with quite a few options as to the materials that they would like the parts to be built out of, and that gives you the ability to have the system tailored exactly the way that you would like it, as opposed to what I deem is the desirable, or are the desirable materials, because who am I to dictate what you need or want for your vehicle? So that little plug aside, you can see again a little quick show of the manifold again. Really happy with how it just came out, and you can see there's obviously plenty of clearance all around for the exhaust and for all of the other components that go into the turbo system on one of these Yamahas. So with all that being said, and with another big project being wrapped up, that is going to be the end of this video. In the next one, we'll probably get back on the silver car a little bit more, as I have a big piece coming for it that is one of the last massive components, or one of the last large components of the puzzle to get this thing just that little bit closer. And we'll say probably about halfway closer, or a third closer, to finally making noise again. So we'll go over that in the next video, start playing around with that a little bit, but that will have to wait until then. So until next time, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and I will see you guys in the next one.